Hello, and welcome to this episode of Rule of Carnage, a series of podcasts, videos, conversation between myself, Glenn Ford, a games designer and developer, and my good chum, Mike Hutchinson, also games designer and developer. If you've been watching this series of videos, you'll be aware that whilst I normally introduce by listing some games that we've worked on, the moment I'm introducing by listing one book that we've worked on, The Fundamentals of Tabletop Miniatures Game Design, a Designer's Handbook, which, as this video goes out, I think should have just gone live on
Mm,
CRC Press, either that or it's going to be live in like the next couple of days.
yep.
Um, so this is a book on how to design miniatures games. In the last video, we talked about the first section, which is a sort of, I guess, an academic philosophical overview of the idea of what these games are, what they do that's unusual or
hmm
interesting and hopefully inspirational. We're going to move on to the second section of the book, which is about some of the, I guess, the raw materials maybe that these games are made out of. These are maybe the things, the mechanics, the elements you have to understand before going into some of the more detailed design pieces of a game like this. I think of this sometimes like, in many ways, writing this textbook was similar to writing a rule book, in that often in a rule
Yeah.
book you'll need to have a section saying like, okay, well, these are the concepts I'm going to need you to understand before I explain to you how actual movement works, actual shooting works. I'm going to need you to understand that this is how I resolve dice in this game, this is how I resolve cards, whatever else we're using.
Yeah, and I sort of think of that, I conceptualize that when I'm writing as the operating system. It's like that's the basic set of functionality that we need to even interact with the chrome of the game components. And then we'll build all the application logic and all of the specific game rules on top of that.
Absolutely. So this section is sort of laying down some of those more fundamental concepts, dice, cards, etc. So, Mike, you've got the book there.
I know. It's
What's
very
the
exciting.
what's the chapter listing for this section, so we can
Well,
talk about
yeah, so
some
we we
bits?
s- we start with the miniatures and measures, which is the sort of, the essential thing that makes these games different to all the others. We then get into some questions of scale and scope, which is just some language that we need to define. But then, frankly, we get into things that might on first blush look like they are just general topics for any sort of tabletop game, things like uncertainty, dice mechanics, card mechanics, genre, theme of and setting, and the topic of resources in a general way is the last one in the book. But in as throughout the sort of section 2 and 3 with this, like we're trying to grab hold of the design affordances and sort of examples from previous games, but also opportunities where there's space that hasn't been utilized to say, well, for example, in dice mechanics, like what is it about dice and miniatures that is meaningful? Yeah, but we start with miniatures and measures because you gotta start with miniatures and measures because we're dealing with miniatures. We've decided that measuring the distances between them in analog space is super interesting, and so um, we talked about it on the channel a fair bit. But like actually, the golden rule that you see in lots of games is kind of just core to the operating system of this sort of format of game. Like we talked about in section 1, there's a section that talks about how like one of the good things about these games is that they are relatively complex and support like tolerance for fudginess, and the tolerance for fudginess is a really strong opportunity for you as a designer, but it means that you've got to have something resembling the golden rule when it comes to like measuring and placing and takesy backsies and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sort of talking about the tape measures and measuring of distances is one of those things that's always going to introduce and require a certain level of um, collaboration within playing these games. And I
Mm.
think, like, saying it's important how you outline that collaboration, where you step in and say, well, this is the hard and fast line, but this is where you need to meet with your opponent and go, we're going to be this level of relaxed or this level of exact. And
Yeah.
yeah, obviously the whole thing of like the fact that when you hold a tape measure over a tabletop, depending on the angle that you're viewing it from, changes the measurement is something that you either have to find some way to deal with that, like measureless movement or templates, whatever
I'll
else.
be honest with you. I've always known that, like, intuitively. It wasn't until I started taking photographs for the book that I realized how insanely sensitive perspective is to whether the tape measure is in or out of range. Like, I could measure a range, and from one particular perspective, it's absolutely in range. And I just shifted by like 30 centimeters the position of my head, and it was obviously out of range, and it was clearly. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's so bizarre. Like,
absolutely, and it's about saying, look, two reasonable people being entirely honest and not trying to sort of game for advantage or any of these sorts of things can have a genuine disagreement about what is an objective fact. The distance
mm,
between these two miniatures is an objective fact, but the way that you're measuring it, the way that you're dealing with it, isn't in this space, and it's sort of laying out where you have to help your players around that, and decrease the level of disagreement and problem. And we've spoken before again about the golden rule, about how it is important to have some sort of payout that hopefully is thematic to the game as well,
mm.
and that players can go back to. I mean, we've said before, the reason this podcast is called Rule of Carnage is because the best one of those we come up with is the Gaslands Rule of Carnage, where it's both thematic and definitive, that it can just shut down all arguments in a way that sort of really works for the game.
Or rather than I wouldn't say shut down arguments. It allows the people at the table to like really quickly reach a consensus that feels right in the spirit of this game.
Yeah, end arguments in a satisfying manner for all
Yeah,
people concerned, rather
collaboratively.
than shut them down.
The next chapter is scale and scope, and I'll talk a little bit about it. But I'm sad about this chapter because you see this girl here. Shortly after I took this photograph, I trod on this model and it was absolutely annihilated. There's no way of repairing it. And it was such a beautiful little conversion job and a good paint job, but there
But
it is, memorialized.
yeah, preserved for perpetuity.
It's next to my Skeletor Hero Quest paint job as well,
Love that one.
which you can't see in glorious black and white. So this chapter is basically saying, look, we agree that model and ground scale are terms. We'd like to sort of introduce the idea of game scale and game scope, because necessarily, you've got to shrink relative reality, to fit it on a kitchen table. And so there's this sort of notion that Glenn's introduced of like, what is my basic game measurement unit, and therefore what's the kind of scale of my game, because it's not actually often related to the scale of the miniatures. That's like a separate aesthetic choice. And then we were just constantly wrestling, as we do, with the fact that whether it's a skirmish game or a mass battle game or a warband game or a large warband game, like we needed a label to attach to those sort of definitional bits of data, and so we called that scope. It's like, what's the number of combatants and the level of detail that we're going to. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's again the thing I think we've come across over and over is that the language around these games is often quite casual and what is used amongst sort of players, but it does sometimes get in the way of discussing some of the mechanics. So yeah, there's ground scale, or miniature scale, which is like, my mini is 28 mil tall and he's meant to be round about 6 foot, so that tells me the distance of what he should be able to travel within a certain time, and what sort of distance my table represents. And that's one thing. Then there's game scale, which is about, okay, but I want him to be able to get to here within X many turns, and I want my game to last for X many turns, and for that to come to a specific conclusion. And so a lot of the time, the distance I want something to move is based on those concerns, rather than this is how far a guy could walk in the time it takes some other guy to load and fire a bow.
Yeah, and it totally depends on your design objective. Like, Pacific Command was the first time where, like, I sat down at the beginning of the process, researched the speeds, distances, how far aircraft can travel, all that kind of stuff. And then I plotted out all of the measurements for the game in nautical miles, and then worked out like what a conversion to a ground scale that would make sense to tell these stories are. Ordinarily, with like Billion Suns, I've nothing to do to start that process other than to say, well, what is the most interesting set of game relationships that will fit on a normal table, and then kind of work outwards from that. And with Billion Suns, like, model scale matters much less in a spaceship game, so I could do that in a very I want to say abstracted way, but it's a very game focused way rather than a miniatures and simulation, a sort of reality simulation focused way. Which for Pacific Command, I was starting from that reality simulation thing just because that was the genre tropes that I wanted to hit.
Yeah, and actually, this is one area where the Rick Priestley book, I think, has a really nice chapter on ground scale and talking about, like, if we convert, let's say, World War II guns to a ground scale that will fit onto any kind of reasonable table, we actually have to do a Sigma curve where, like, the short range weapons have to go up and the long range weapons go down, because otherwise even a moderately sort of medium range weapon would be able to fire at the guy on the table 3 rooms away, and a shorter range weapon wouldn't fire the length of a single tank, let alone sort of any useful distance. And acknowledging, like, okay, well, there's simulation and there's playable game, and where those two meet. Yeah, and like, yeah, scope is one of those ones where it was just handy to have a second word, because we often talk about the scale of a game being also about, yeah, whether it's a mass battle game or an individual miniature skirmish game, which is unhelpful when you've got, well, what scale is your game? Well, it's 28mm. No, I meant how many people are on the battlefield. And it's like, well, let's call how many people are on the battlefield the scope of your game, the size of the story it's trying to tell, as opposed to the scale of the game, as in, how does it literally scale to the size of an actual human being.
Yeah, and it has a strong relationship to detail, but it's not the same, because I can have a very quick playing, not very detailed game for 4 or 5 heroes battling, or I could have something that's got, a mass battle sweep to it in terms of the number of miniatures, but I'm choosing to make a very detailed combat system and so forth. So yeah, there I think they naturally sort of guide your design in one direction or another with regards to rules details, but as we'll get into, uh, as actually we didn't get into in the first section, there's an idea of this narrative focus, and where you put the detail in your rule systems is where the player's eye and attention is drawn, and therefore like where the camera is pulling focus on.
Yeah.
So even the concept of detail for me is kind of a juicy, complex topic of, there's detail and there's detail.
Yeah,
Where you put
absolutely.
the detail is meaningful.
As we said before, your game is about what your players spend most of their time doing. Irrespective of what you think it's about, if they spend half their time doing X, that's what the game is really about. And if you want to tell a particular narrative story about a particular thing, focusing the mechanics around that thing, so that's what players spend physically most of the time at their tabletop doing, is one of the ways you direct and signpost people, and you create the narrative of the game.
I'm chuckling because I played another game of Warhammer 40,000 last night, and I believe that game is about complaining about the business model. I think that's what that game is about. It seems to be what most of us spend the time doing. He said as he was trying to play with an orc army, but he doesn't own the codex, so he doesn't have the rules. And then the meat of section 2 of the fundamentals of tabletop miniature games design : a designer's handbook. The meat of section 2 is the stuff about uncertainty, and then how you create uncertainty, and what those classic cards and dice sort of utility pieces can be used for. The uncertainty chapter is fun actually, because that one was kind of mostly new for me. That's mostly a Glenn chapter. Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of how you see or how you research these different kinds of uncertainty, and where they relate?
Yeah, well, I mean,
very social game format.
Yeah, the I guess the most obvious thing that people think of and most familiar with when you say uncertainty in the game is our stochastic uncertainty.
Yeah, it's the dice rolling.
It's your dice rolling, it's your card pulling, it's randomness, whatever you want to call it. And there's a huge chapter on dice mechanics and on card mechanics, because there's obviously a lot to talk about there. And then there's uncertainty due to complexity, which is what you might see in a game of chess. You start a game of chess, it's uncertain what the outcome is going to be, even though there's zero randomness anywhere in that game, because the sheer bushiness of the decision tree makes it very difficult for anybody who isn't like a huge chess grandmaster to see what's coming.
Yeah.
But I think in minis games, the uncertainty due to complexity is really sort of an interesting twofold thing, because you've got like these tend to be complex games with a lot of rules interactions, and then also the non-discrete nature of them means that any given movement can have like infinite complexity in it, and how human beings break that down into, well, there's actually only like 3 useful decisions here. It is a way that your game gets passed out by a person, and how you make it so that there are only 3 interesting decisions. Rather, you don't want every single movement to have an infinity of like unpredictable complexity, because the game would never get anywhere.
Yeah, that's sort of like to concretize that, like overlapping auras is interesting. Like a commander that has a command aura, or a monster that has a scary aura, like those are interesting. But they are interesting and usable if they are sparse. If like every model provides +1 courage to every other model within 3 inches, like I've got this incredibly dense sort of overlapping aura thing that I need to visualize, and that might be why Billion Suns is kind of hard work. But that like finding the right balance between interesting intersections of all these analogs, blobs, and an unmanageable level of decision making.
Yeah, making the geometric puzzle interesting, I think, is part of that. Then we've got like social uncertainty, which is that I am playing with a human being, and they are a complex and mysterious figure.
Oh, this isn't does my opponent like me?
Yeah, hopefully not. Yeah, this is about sort of what decisions is the other person going to make. Games are often about, one of the main reasons we give victory conditions in a game is to make the opponent predictable in an interesting way.
Yeah.
One of the ways someone can totally spoil sport a game is to just stop caring about the victory conditions and acting in a completely random way, and therefore being a very unsatisfying sort of source of uncertainty to interact with at the tabletop. And this is one of the things, like I always say, whenever you have like a bluffing opportunity in a game, laying in the pieces that allows the person being bluffed to actually interact with that bluff, rather than just sort of go, it doesn't really matter which of these things you're actually telling the truth about, because whichever of the 2 things you've decided, I'm going to act the exact same way, either way. I want to like...
Yeah, and this social uncertainty is where the gotcha moments sort of arise from, which is like I thought I had an understanding of like the space within I could predict you'd move. It's an interesting broad space, and then you suddenly do something completely outside of my understood space, and you're like, well, that's annoying. I was trying to enjoy your uncertainty space, but you've just blown it to pieces, so everything was pointless.
Yeah, a certain amount of uncertainty. It's like at the moment I'm reading the Sid Meier autobiography, which is a really interesting book, and there's a bit in that where he talks about when they were designing Railroad Tycoon, he put in a thing where there were these random floods that wiped out chunks of your railway, and it was incredibly unsatisfying. He's like, well, I'm not quite sure why it's unsatisfying, because we have disasters in SimCity and that works. And the answer is that sort of uncertainty is often the game designer being like, well, look at how clever I'm being. Imagine their face when this happens. This is going to be great. And that sort of uncertainty and those sorts of gotchas are often more about the game designer wanting to have their relationship of uncertainty with the player. And what's more important is that the player has a relationship of uncertainty with the game. So in Railroad Tycoon, you can buy a wooden bridge that is cheap but will get flooded out, or you can buy a steel bridge that's more expensive that will survive the flood. And then if you buy your wooden bridges and you get flooded out, it's like, well, that's fair enough. That was my decision. I had a relationship with that.
Yeah.
Whereas you buy a steel bridge and you get still there when the floodwaters recede and feel very smug about your intelligence. And making gotcha moments into things that are about the relationship between the players at the tabletop, where somebody can go, fair enough, the information was there, the I could have mitigated against that, and I chose not to spend resources on mitigating against it. So now that I'm getting smacked around by that decision, good, that's fair enough. Whereas if it's like, ha ha ha, this player and the game designer like did a little conflab and then just smacked you in the head with something that you could do nothing about, is a horrible kind of social uncertainty. Because
and this sort of points at maybe the last area of uncertainty as well, which is like, to a degree, like there's an element to which you would like to give the players in some regards perfect information about all of the faction rules and all of the special rules. And like if you're playing a game like War Machine or Malifaux at a high level, like you're studying all of the rules to make sure that you understand what everything is capable of. But like the complexity is such that it's quite difficult to know all the information. But that leads to like an area of uncertainty that isn't very accessible to us, which we've talked about before, which is like video games are brilliant at like hiding the game mechanics and then allowing me to discover both the mechanics and the content over the course of the game. But in a game where we have to give you in a form where we have to give you the whole game and you have to execute the code by reading it, like it's without a game master hiding information, it's almost impossible to sort of have the sort of uncertainty by discovery that video games do so naturally.
yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the things where in the board game space, you can see like legacy games playing with that sort of uncertainty by discovery by having like little boxes that you crack open in the middle of a game and poop out a new rule, which is really, really hard for us to do because our product tends to be a book that you have to read cover to cover before even beginning to operate any part of the game.
I think it's also really challenging because for tabletop games, full stop, like the gameplay loop tends to be so long that like introducing a gotcha by being like, no, this attack is unblockable, like you're screwed every time this like attack that you didn't know about comes out. Like in a game like Dark Souls, you can be like, oh, okay, I have to deal with this, and I have to deal with this by learning through iteration and rote. And games like Kingdom Death Monster that take this idea to heart are very frustrating to play because, okay, fine, you punished me with a piece of information that I couldn't know about, and now I know, but it's going to take me like 90 minutes to get back around that loop rather than 90 seconds in a video game.
Yeah, absolutely. And this sort of relates to the concept of competence within a system, which is something I talk about a little bit. And that's a really spicy thing to throw into a game where one person knows more than the other person about a given thing, and a certain amount of that is going to exist in most games, certainly games with list building. But how much and what access each person has to that information is really important, because people hate having lesser competence within a system. It really genuinely shuts down people's decision making in a way that's quite fascinating to sort of to look into, and you can read around it. And yeah, being really careful with that, because it wrecks people's like logic centers. The fact that it can be identical to like stochastic uncertainty, but the fact that the stochastic uncertainty is dependent on something that you happen to know the truth of and I don't, just tends to make people go, I hate that decision and I don't have any part of it. And the last bit of uncertainty is performative uncertainty.
Oh yeah.
And so that's something that's like we're super familiar with in dexterity games, where I'm going to try to do X. Everyone knows I'm going to try to do X. Nobody knows like whether I'm going to succeed, because doing X is just physically difficult to achieve.
Yeah, this is the sort of uncertainty that sports thrive on. Like,
absolutely.
Will I be able to execute the act rather than have I thought of the right action to take?
Absolutely, and we have this quite a lot with like estimating distances in miniatures games. That turns up all
Yeah.
and even if it isn't like estimating a range for an artillery weapon, at least when we're moving a miniature and we're eyeballing whether it will be in range of a certain thing or a certain attack when the other person sort of acts. That's where we've got a level of performative uncertainty in almost all of these games. And again, controlling like if you allow full pre-measuring for someone to go, well, I'm not having performative uncertainty. I'm going to pre-measure everything you can.
Yeah, and this like that I think is something that was really interesting for me writing this book is I mentioned before I think that one of the things that writing this book changed my mind on is that I was a die-hard abstract line of sight uh, uh, adept, and I'm seeing now where the specific use cases for Model's eye line of sight are in a similar way. Like I was absolutely dyed in the wool on pre-measuring is the best, like pre-measuring is the only true way, but pre-measuring, as you just point out, like it eliminates this whole performative uncertainty area for your game, and that might be suitable for a design, but it's also shutting down a design space that you have access to. And so being thoughtful about um, okay, if I'm going to take the performative element of measuring and estimating out because I'm going to let people pre-measure and put little empty bases and all that kind of stuff, are there other places that I can put that back in? Like, is there anything that's interesting about the physical table stuff that I've got that, like, you know, moving models might be interesting, moving models, moving dice, placing cards, placing things. Like we've got all this lovely analog physical placement stuff going on. It's you know, having written this chapter, I'm now feeling sad about the fact that, you know, well, if you don't use any of that placement stuff, like you're missing out on an opportunity, and that might be the right thing for the game to exclude that sort of uncertainty. But it's definitely there. It's definitely a possibility. It's
Yeah,
worthy
absolutely.
of
True line
consideration.
of sight and no pre-measuring are bugbears for many people, but they have a value to them, and performative uncertainty is a lot of the value to them. There's something very performative about trying to get a guy in a position where he can see through a window and snipe somebody on the other side of it, and needing to like eyeball that, and there's
Yeah,
a sense of like
it's just that it combines with an uncertainty of the result, whether it was true or not, that means that you can end up with field ads
absolutely.
because it just isn't certain whether the performative act has actually had the outcome, the binary outcome that everyone can agree on.
Yeah, and obviously dexterity elements are a big part of performative uncertainty on tabletop games, and
Mm.
dexterity is one of those things that we don't use a massive amount, and it has a level of, I don't know if I'd say like controversy, but obviously there is disabled accessibility issues when you introduce a level of
Mm.
dexterity based uncertainty, and you can get a lot out of dexterity based uncertainty, and it can make a sort of a lot of interest to a game, but it can also slow the game down if it's not based around it, and it can be limiting in access sort of areas. And so having alternatives and using it sparingly, I think, is an important thing to think of with that.
Yeah, and so this idea of performative uncertainty and the next chapter on dice mechanics, like writing these really opened my eyes to some possibilities. And so Space Gits, which you can download from Itch in a prototype format, was a direct response to writing these chapters and being like, oh wow, yeah, there's a whole opportunity for physical performative uncertainty and different utilization of the physical objects of dice that we can use. So my game Space Gits just takes a lot of the ideas that we discussed, that we point to in this book as being like, there's not a lot of games that are messing around with this. I was like, right, all right, let's go mess around with this because this sounds fun. So yeah, dice mechanics, like won't go into like excruciating detail on this because we've done it a few times on the channel, and you can read the chapter, but obviously there are some critical topics to cover when it comes to dice, about like, you know, what size and granularity of dice or dice pools do you use, like what relationships do those different dice have to the sort of expectations and history of their usage in other games, like what's the value versus the cost of using custom dice, which is, you know, very common in miniatures board games, you know, almost ubiquitously use custom dice, but in our sort of do it yourself world, they're a bigger hurdle. And then how do you strategize around what you do with the dice as it relates to testing skills, testing the model's characteristics, combining things.
Yeah, obviously the dice chapter is one of the bigger chapters, and it's a
Mm,
crunchy one. It gets into like these are just details of the nature of probability, and it's dice. The dice chapter is followed very quickly by the card mechanics chapter,
mm,
and talking about the ways that uncertainty works differently with them, and the different affordances they can give. And again, yeah, we've talked about affordances and card-based resolution mechanics on the channel before, and it's just going really detailed into a lot of that, talking about the mechanics, what they give you, what they take away, what you should consider, how you can be generous with your players in
mm.
using them, where you're sort of requiring people to gather components can be a barrier to entry as opposed to something that's inviting or interesting. Because it's like, the first time I picked up Malifaux, and it's like, well, we use a deck of cards. It was like, I'm playing this. I don't care. I'm playing this immediately, because it was
Mm.
so exciting and interesting to see somebody using something incredibly available, incredibly open, that hadn't really been touched before. And I think if you can access that, it's a huge assist to your game.
And yet there were people in our club who, flippantly or otherwise, when I asked them, do they play Malifaux, they would just say, no, it doesn't use dice, as if that was a concrete, conclusive answer to why that game would not be worth playing.
Mm.
And, maybe it was a flippant answer, but like on some level, that's true for some people. It's like, no, this is too different. I'm not interested. I like the thing. If it doesn't have the thing, then I won't play it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in both the card and dice mechanics, we also explore the other physical uses. So, like, record keeping, space marking, relationships of where the object lands in the play area. Like, all of this good stuff is in there, those chapters as well, in order to sort of say it's not just for, producing random numbers, but there's all these other fun activities that you can do with both the
yeah.
cards and the dice. So, yeah, we won't go into too much detail because there's tons to dig
Mm.
into in those chapters. Um, and then we talked a bit about how like in the first chapter we talk about the creation of fantasy
Mm.
as an important factor of making any game. I believe, anything other than a pure abstract game, the evocation of the fantasy and the lot of engaging of the person's imagination about both both a sort of intrinsic diegetic enjoyment of like, I want to enter this fantasy world, but also a helpful engaging of a sort of center of logic that's like, okay, the actions that I will take in this game that will progress towards victory and that make sense are because of me imagining myself in this particular situation, or as this particular kind of person. And what we wanted to examine in the raw materials chapter is that, like, it's really, really clear that one of the key raw materials for any of these games that we make is like, what genre is it? What sort of thematic area does it fit within when you're looking across the notional aisles of a game store? Does it fit in fantasy or science fiction or horror or historical? And there is, as we've noticed before, there are massive gaps in that line. There are sections labeled romance and mystery that have almost no miniature games in them.
Mm.
um Even crime, for example, is almost bereft of miniature games.
Mm.
And sort of nodding to that and giving a brief discussion, but then sort of moving on to, well, what is it about these genres and these genre tropes that is important and useful to you to consider as a designer? Because they are powerful shortcuts for
Mm.
bringing the player to understanding your game, and bringing two players to sharing an understanding of what it is that they're going to be doing, and therefore kind of maximizing their ability to have fun. And I think that, as Glenn, I think, was talking about in one of the previous videos, like, it's not necessarily a negative that we rely on genre tropes. We're providing parts of the experience that reading a piece of genre fiction or watching a goofy B movie can't provide, because they are non-interactive. They live in their visuals and their sound and their ideas, whereas we're living in decision spaces. And in our particular a part of the gaming hobby in like the, you know, in the relationship between the physical objects that I'm making and the hobby loop and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes game designers are a bit frustrated that it's like, well, a novel can do this with a genre story, and a movie can do that. Why can't I do that? Some of those things, and it's like, well, because you're a game, you can do a thing they can't do. It's not
Mm,
your job to show people what a pirate looks like. That's the job of Pirates of the Caribbean. It's not your job to tell people, the history and the background of this particular pirate's life. That's the job of a book on pirates. It's your job to say, you are now a pirate with a pirate's concerns. You know those, you've read those, you've watched the movies. Now what's it like to make those decisions like in real time as that pirate? That's the bit you can do. And just sort of pulling in various genre tropes, I think, is like, it's a gift to us. It's not something to be afraid of, and it's not a failing in games. It's, this is our space, this is their space. Let's use each other's bits in a sort of collaborative way. Um, Again, it is, yeah. I say pirates again because I'm reading the Sid Meier autobiography. There's a bit in there where he designed Sid Meier's pirates, partly because I can just stick a picture of a dude in a fluffy, flowy shirt on the deck of a ship, and bang, you know everything about what his life is like. You know what he does, what his concerns are, how he treats villains when he's sword fighting, that he searches for treasure, that he hunts for lost relatives, all those sorts of things instantaneously. And
yeah.
I don't need to spend hours and hours playing that out and building that background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the only other thing worth mentioning in the second section of the book is the chapter on resources, which are that's another, like the cards and the dice. It's quite a gritty chapter about like what are the specific uses and places that you can build kind of resource management, resource kind of exchange between players, and what kind of emergent puzzles can you create by having those kind of resources. You know, particularly the difference between giving players resources that only act towards one particular part of the game mechanic, or giving them these like much more fungible resources where you can, you know, you can be much more broad in your decision about, oh well, I've got 6 of these coins and I can use them in lots of different places, so where will I spend them? Yeah. And there are lots of like really basic obvious resources that we deploy without even thinking, things like wounds and stuff, where, you know, identifying that wounds are a common resource, but they are a subclass of resource, means you can kind of look at some other things that you do with resources and the way that you might handle those and go, oh, am I thinking about wounds in the most interesting way? Can I hook them into other parts of the system? Can I change the way that they are recorded? You know, are they recorded physically, or you know, or in a Cartesian way, or like there's all kinds of places that you might find common resources that we don't necessarily, you know, activation points, numbers of turns. Like there are all these things that we count but could be used in more interesting and fungible ways if the design makes sense to explore that.
Absolutely. Once you consider activations and wounds as resources and potentially fungible resources, these games are all resource management games at that point.
Mm.
And adding in extra economies, extra resources that interact with those two primary resource sort of areas,
Mm.
it gives a lot of play, it gives a lot of interest and a lot of interaction. So
Mm.
yeah, it's a way of looking at the games for certain. Okay, so that's section 2 of the fundamentals of tabletop miniatures game design, a designer's handbook.
Sean Sutter's image does look very nice on this front cover.
It's yeah.
Thanks, Sean.
Sean's often do. So as you say, it's available. It's either currently or soon to be available in CRC Press. There'll be a link in the down below where you can swing past. And
And regardless of where you are in the world, it's free shipping if you order direct from CRC. You can also pick it up from bookshops, online bookshops and Amazon and so forth. But may
yeah,
as well get it from these guys because the discount on the cover may not cover the free shipping that CRC would give you.
Absolutely, and we've mentioned it in the videos, but do please disregard the hardback. The CRC is an academic publisher. The hardback is for universities, not for us normal folk with normal sized budgets for these things. It is sort of academic publisher prices. Go for the paperback. I think is the best option there. While you're down there looking across those links, swing down and give us a comment in the comment section about one of the bits we've talked about in relation to this section of the book. Hit the like and subscribes, swing over to our Discord and have a chat with us about any of the subjects we've covered here or more. Do you think there's something was missing? It might actually be in there, we just didn't talk about it. Check the chapter listings on the CRC page, because you can like follow along to a certain degree with some of the bits we've been talking about. But for now, I think from this episode of Rule of Carnage, it'll be a thank you and goodbye. So bye-bye.
Bye bye. Cheers.